Good afternoon and welcome to Pittsburgh City Council's public hearing for Tuesday, December 4th, 2021, relative to bills 2021-2094, 2021-2095, and 2096. I'm Bobby Wilson. I'm the Land Use and Economic Development Chair. Will the clerk please read the bill?
Bill number 2094, an ordinance amending the Pittsburgh Code, Title 9, Zoning Code, Article 5, Chapter 912, Accessory Uses and Structures, Section 912.04, Accessory Use and Structure Development and Operational Standards, Chapter 914, Parking, Loading, and Access, Section 914.07, Alternative Access Plans, Chapter 925, Measurements, Section 925.06, Setbacks to update the standards for fences and walls, parking pads and garages for residential uses with fewer than 5 spaces and other accessory uses and structures. Bill number 2095, an ordinance amending the Pittsburgh Code, Title 9 Zoning Code, Article 5, Use Regulations, Chapter 911, Primary Uses, Section 911.02, Use Table, and Section 911.04, Use Standards, Chapter 912, Accessory Uses and Structures, Section 912.04, Accessory Use and Structure Development and Operational Standards, Chapter 913, Use Exceptions and Conditions not listed in the Use Table, Section 913.04, Special Exceptions, and Article 6, Development Standards, Chapter 914, Parking, Loading, and Access, Section 914.02, Off-Street Parking Schedules, to update the standards and definitions for restaurant and restaurant fast food uses, and to update the standards for other drive-through uses within the city of Pittsburgh. And Bill number 2096, an ordinance amending the Pittsburgh Code, Title 9, Zoning, Article 9, Development Review Procedures, Chapter 922, Measurements by amending language in Section 922.02.
Thank you. All right. I will announce members as they join, if they join, and if any members show up online, someone please tell me, because I can't, for some reason, I can't tell on this version, I think, right, Bill? All right. No, I mean, I think you even have to, that's fine. All right. Our first order of business will be an introduction. Presentation by Kate Ruckus, Corey Lehman, and possibly Director Dash from the city's Department of City Planning. Following that, we'll have testimony by, we have 2 registered speakers I see. All right, Corey or Kate, either one of you want to kick it off?
Thank you, Councilman. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, perfect.
All right, I'm trying to dodge the sunshine here, which is something I'm not used to doing this time of year.
Don't worry, the blue is coming in perfect.
Good, we got the blue down. So yeah, I'm here on behalf of Director Dash in the Department of City Planning. I'm Corey Lehman. I'm the city's zoning administrator and an assistant director in the Department of City Planning, joined by my colleague Kate Ruckus. We have 3 bills that the clerk read in today. If it's okay with you, we'll present them sort of all at once, and unless you'd prefer to have individual items.
No, that's fine. Why don't you just go right through them all? Because I don't have them. I would say we could do them in order and then split up the speakers, but we only have 2 speakers, so let's go through all of them. Okay,
thank you. And we have a PowerPoint presentation, I believe, that we sent ahead. Is that something we could also share it, I think, from our screens, if that's easier?
Whatever you'd like. I think, Bill, do they have capability of doing PowerPoint? They just share your screen.
All right. Hopefully Kate's got that lined up.
Yeah, I got it. Give me 1 second.
Should have double checked that before I said that we would.
And can you see it?
Yeah.
Great. And I'm going to go to full screen mode.
All right. Thank you, Kate. Thank you, council members. And thanks, everyone. This is the first of the 3 bills that we have today. These are, before I go into this specific bill, I'll just say these 3 bills all address some challenges that we've had in the code that we identified over, over a period of time working with the zoning code. The first bill is addressing, is actually the second time that we've done amendments to the code after doing some research into the case history, compiling data from our zoning board cases and utilizing that data to identify cases that come to the zoning board and are approved more often than not. So these are cases that, and you'll see in the presentation, have a relatively high approval rate by the zoning board. They are not terribly controversial when they come to the board. Variances are a type of exception that the board is able to grant an exception to the rules of the code. We're only talking about dimensional variances that we've been looking at, which have to do with structures and uses within setbacks typically. And in particular, in this case, we identified that there were some tweaks that we could make to our rules around fences, parking, and decks that would make things more efficient for the zoning board by taking some of the caseload away, which would mean that more significant cases wouldn't have to wait as long to have their public hearing. Also, it means that customers who have these applications, again, this could be a resident of the city who just wants to install a new fence. If they got caught up in something that requires a variance, that could add several months and additional cost to their normal timeline for review of something simple like a fence or a deck. And so this can save money and time for our residents who are doing relatively small work within the city. And so this particular bill is just an effort to respond to the data that we have and to make our process more efficient. And I will get into the presentation in a second. Quickly, the other 2 bills. The second one is a response to is more policy oriented. It's something that we worked with the mayor's office on and with a number of community organizations who expressed concerns about the sort of that had been a lot of drive-throughs, drive-through uses, banks and pharmacies, and drive-through restaurants, creating, starting to be proposed in our small, sort of intimate neighborhood business districts. And we wanted to revisit those requirements, look at where a purely vehicle-oriented use like a drive-through could be permitted in the city, and make some changes around drive-throughs. And then the final one is in response to changes that we made with a new permitting system that was implemented a little bit before the pandemic, but the pandemic sort of set us back in the process of having some of the languages within the code catch up to some of the new terminology and process within the new permitting system. So this is largely cleaning up some language in the code, not a very policy-oriented piece of legislation, but I'll cover the details of that when we go through the presentation. So Kate, if you don't mind. Okay, so this amendment will revise the standards for the fences, decks, residential parking pads, and garages with fewer than 4 spaces. This comes from, as I said, the research of over 2,800 requests to the board from the time period between 2016 and through 2021. The goal of the study was to identify variances and special exception requests that are often approved universally by the board. And the amendments, like as I said, would reduce the caseload coming to the zoning board. Next slide. So looking at fences first, in the time period that we looked at, there were over 100 requests for fences, and 84% of those fence requests were approved, but all of the ones that were denied were for a typology of privacy fence, so usually a solid 6-foot high fence in the front yard or an exterior yard in residential districts. And so we decided to address the 84%, not the 17% that were denied, or the 84 cases and not the 17 that were denied. Next slide. So looking at the code, the prior language in the code was within a section called features allowed within the setbacks. This is the way that fences are managed today. It is frankly confusing. There's a standard for 6.5 feet in height for privacy fences, which is confusing to folks because the standard for requiring a building permit is up to 6 feet. So there's an inconsistency with the zoning requirements and the building code requirements, and uses some, let's say old-fashioned language from probably borrowed from the 1958 code. It does have some important standards which we made sure to maintain, but as part of this sort of code cleanup, we decided to move the fence requirements into Chapter 912, which is the accessory structure and use chapter of the zoning code, and appropriately these fit in the accessory use chapter because they are accessory uses. Next slide. So our new proposed fence standards are going to have a similar structure, but it's going to be more consistent with how our code is currently written. So in Chapter 912, we would say fences, walls, etc., are permitted in all districts and shall be subject to the materials and methods and opacity standards that are in section 918.03.b.1, which is the section of the code regarding screening. And so that actually has a much more clear and much more helpful written description of what expectations are around materials and for screening for fences and walls and landscaping. And so the standards that we are adopting are similar to what we have today in front and side yards. When a fence extends closer to a street than the primary structure, only open and ornamental fences are permitted, and they're limited to 4 feet in height. And then in all other instances, fences, walls, and similar features are permitted within required setbacks of a height, within required setbacks to a height of 6 feet, and they can be opaque. The 6 foot height is a reduction from our current standard from 6.5 feet. However, we are then adding number 3, which allows for minor adjustments as an administrator's exception. An administrator exception is a type of permitted use that is reviewed by the zoning administrator from what is permitted in the standards above, and that the exception doesn't have a detrimental impact on adjacent and impacted properties or streets. So we will be taking a look in those cases where someone is requesting, perhaps instead of a 4 foot high fence, requesting a 5-foot high fence, or instead of a 6-foot high fence, they're asking for an exception to have a 7-foot high fence. We're going to be looking at the context. We may ask them to provide letters from the impacted neighbor. We may be looking at and consulting with our colleagues at DOMI to make sure that there isn't a traffic impact from a taller fence at an intersection or something like that. And then the final standards, I'll just really quickly, in the general industrial zoning district, fences up to 6 feet are permitted in all yards, front or side, up to 6 feet tall. And then in the RIV district, Riverfront zoning district, we actually went through and created some special standards regarding fences and walls that relate and are unique to the RIV district. So we just made sure to preserve those standards. And then of course, number 6, barbed wire and razor edge wire, as had been before, are not permitted in any district. Okay, next slide. So we have some simple graphics here to sort of show the difference between what may have been permitted under the current code and what is now permitted in the new code. I think the easiest thing to sort of show you and take away is that, and these are not to scale, they're just illustration. What you're seeing on the left-hand side is if there's a setback, let's say it's a corner lot, there's a setback of 15 feet, 15 feet from that street side yard. You're not allowed to start your fence until 15 feet all the way back. And that may be in a really awkward place, sort of beyond where the existing home is. And so you're allowed to have a 4-foot fence up to sort of anywhere on your property. But as you can see on the right-hand side, we've now said, okay, your privacy fence can go all the way up to, as close, it can go as close to the street as your house goes. The same thing with in the front setback, your privacy fence can come up to the front of the house. And then next slide. Okay, so moving on to parking pads and garages. This is just for smaller scale residential. This is for parking pads and garages that don't exceed 4 spaces. We have additional and different standards when we get into larger parking lots. Since 2017, the board had 115 requests to allow residential parking pads and garages of this scale that didn't comply with the code's setback standards for accessory structures. 80% of those requests for the parking pads have been approved by the board. Of those that were denied, most of them, 10 of 14, were parking pads that were located in the front yard. I want to be really clear, because this is sort of a long-standing standard in the city. We are not permitting, we're not changing anything to allow parking in front yards under this new amendment. And so the other requests, 95% of the ones for garages had been approved as well. And so again, we sort of didn't touch the ones where they were sort of universally denied, which is the front yard parking. But we work to make efficiencies in the code for the other cases. So if we could go to the next slide. So the current standards for parking for garages or parking pads, which is just a place to park, a parking space, they are the same standards that are that all accessory uses and structures are required to use, which is that accessory structures are to comply with the front setback, the same front setback that is required for primary structures, and side setback is the same way, but rear setbacks are only 5 feet when the rear of the lot isn't adjacent to a way, and 2 feet when it is. So that allows for a parking pad or a garage to be located in the rear yard. Most often what we have here in where the variances occurred are cases where the garage is located in the rear or the parking pad is located in the rear, but was within a side setback also in that rear yard. So the illustrations on the next slide should be helpful. Oh, except that's not on the next slide, on the next slide from this one. And then our new standards allow that parking pads for 4 spaces or garages that don't comply with the setback standards for accessory uses and structures can be approved subject to the standards below. They can be in the side and rear yard setbacks, so it's still not in the front yard. And they can also be on street side yards, but they can't be closer to the street than the primary structure. And that's the same concept that we were looking at with the privacy fences. And then in front yards, parking pads and garages shall be set back 5 feet from the primary structure, so behind the front of the house. And then additional standards, sometimes when folks install parking pads and garages, there are challenges with stormwater runoff. And so we're making sure that there's a standard addressing the stormwater runoff that we would include in our plan review. And then the additional standard, working with our colleagues at the Department of Mobility and Infrastructure, there is a concern sometimes when you have tight parking areas that cars would begin to creep out into the right of way, blocking the sidewalk, or even getting into the street cartway. And so we have a standard just to make sure that the absolute minimum standard or minimum size for a parking stall in the city would be that same standard that we have in larger parking lots for compact size parking stalls, and that they are not encroach on the right of way or neighboring properties. So next slide. And here it is illustrated. You can see the current code, because sometimes we have cases where there are larger setbacks than where the actual home is located. There can be sometimes a very limited area, especially on narrower lots, area that isn't feasible to locate a parking pad or a garage. And with the amendment, you can see there are the cases where this allows for a lot more of the rear yard to be available for parking pads and garages, and then allows in some contexts in the city, you'll know that some homes have sort of side yard driveways so there's sort of a wider side yard, and there is an area where a car could pull back. And so this allows the use of that, but the zoning board wanted to be clear that a detached garage or a parking pad would still be set back from the front of the house a little bit, so that it provides that sort of break from the front of the home and maintains the context of the front and the rhythm of the front yards facing the street. Next slide. Okay, and then finally looking at decks and porches, again, over 108 or over 100 requests, 108 exactly since 2017 for decks and porches that didn't meet the code's existing standards for accessory structures and exemptions for porches. And of those, 94% were granted by the zoning board. And so going to the next slide. I'm not going to get too far into the weeds on what the code had required. There is sort of a standard front porch and rear porch exception for sort of a by right typical city front porch or rear porch, which is not more than 9 feet deep. And then there are also the standards, as I mentioned before, for accessory structures. But as you saw We still had over 100 cases just over a few years come in through the zoning board. So the exemptions that we already had weren't doing enough. So next slide. So the new, I'm sorry, these are right, this is the new standard. So using an administrator's exception that is already in the code in section 925.06.G.2. This is a group where we have a lot of exceptions, have that same standard about not being closer to the street or a neighboring property than the building line of the existing primary structure. This is actually in the last round of research that we did on the zoning board, we made this change for HVAC units. We're making the same change for decks that as an administrator's exception, you are able to locate the porches and decks within the setbacks. So next slide. So this one, we've got 3 colors. It's a little bit more confusing. But as you can see on the left-hand side, there's a lot of red where decks and porches were not permitted. Again, this is not to scale. This is a bit of an exaggerated plan. But now you can see the area that's permitted by right for decks and porches doesn't change. But the area where an administrator's exception might allow a deck and a porch is opened up to really all of the property. Now that comes into play as we found with decks and porches, that there really are a lot of sort of unique examples, unique scenarios where folks are looking for decks and porches that just can't comply with either the administrator's exceptions that we had or the setback standards that we had. And the zoning board was finding that these applications weren't in any way detrimental. There wasn't, it really wasn't a concern from adjacent neighbors. However, using the administrator's exception program that we have for this type of structure, we would require a letter we would require the applicant to reach out to the neighbor that's impacted. So if they were expanding the deck into the left-hand side or into the, let's say into the rear a little bit further, we would have, in this scenario, we would have them contact that neighbor, show them their plans, get a letter from the neighbor acknowledging that they've seen the plans and that they don't have any significant concerns. And in that case, assuming that it meets the other standards, we would move forward with that administrator's exception. Typically, when we don't receive a letter or if the neighbors reach out to us with concerns, then we'll look at the case a lot more closely. We may choose just to send it to the zoning board. I may determine that there's more of a detrimental impact. A lot of times, usually with decks and porches, that can tend to be because of grade changes and impact on the close proximity to, in some of our tighter lot areas, areas with like row homes, things can get a little bit tight. So if you're building out a deck on the entire backyard, sometimes that could cause some problems. All right, next slide. Okay, and then as a part of this particular bill, because we were working in this section 925, we added a couple things that are features that are allowed within setbacks that had been more or less permitted under sort of a more broad category, but we just wanted to be explicit so there wasn't any question. One is solar energy and small wind energy systems on rooftops. We haven't had any trouble permitting those in the past. We have treated them basically as mechanical, same as we would a rooftop air conditioning unit. But in this case, we just wanted to be explicit that this was permitted. And then the other one is the code hadn't stated explicitly that, let's say, perhaps your bird bath or your garden gnome is within a setback. While we've never required anyone to submit a plan or get a permit for their garden gnome, we just wanted to be sure that it was clear in the code that that's not something that we're interested in regulating. All right, next slide. And finally, one more code cleanup. It's been a while now. We actually came through in a different part of chapter 914 and introduced a number of standards and exceptions related to bicycle parking. But there had been a special exception regarding bicycle parking that wasn't deleted at that time. It really became redundant. Hasn't really been used since, because there is a more lenient, there is a standard and then there's a more lenient exception for related to bicycle parking. So this is just cleaning up something that we probably should have done at that time. And I think that's the end of this bill's presentation. Is that right? It is. Okay. So the next bill, Council Bill 2096 of 2021. This is specifically regarding restaurant and other drive-through uses. Next slide. So the intent of this legislation, as I stated a little bit in the beginning, is to reduce the negative impacts that we see from vehicle-oriented uses within mixed-use neighborhoods, our smaller, more local commercial districts, and to realign the parking requirements for restaurants to the actual needs. I'll get into that in a little bit more detail. To simplify the definitions of restaurants that had actually caused some problems over the years, and then to require drive-through uses when they are permitted to provide some transportation impact reporting and study, and that they would implement the recommendations of that kind of study. Next slide. So currently in the zoning code, there are 4 use types for restaurants. There is restaurant fast food limited, restaurant fast food general, and then there's restaurant limited and restaurant general. That has caused some problems over the years because restaurant fast food definition can overlap with a lot of things that we typically think of as restaurants. And the restaurant definition that was in the code basically had us regulating or defining a restaurant by the type of plateware that was used, and that's not really efficient and relevant to how restaurants operate today. So because we don't have a lot of applications for cafeteria type restaurants, and so we really wanted to just do a little bit of a reset and treat restaurant fast food as really those vehicle oriented fast food restaurants. These are restaurants with a drive-through. Typically they're chain restaurants. And they are defining them based on having a drive-through window. And then the really everything else, and in our code that's serving food and drink, food or drink, is considered a restaurant. And we have the same 2 categories of restaurant. Restaurant limited is less than 2,400 square feet. It doesn't have live music or entertainment, and restaurant general is greater and or with live music. Next one. Okay. So restaurant fast food with a separate curb cut is currently permitted in the urban neighborhood commercial, the urban industrial, the general industrial, the highway commercial, and the Riverfront Industrial Mixed Use District. And under the new zoning, under the new zoning that we're proposing, it would just be limited to the highway commercial district where it's permitted by right, and the general industrial district where it would be a special exception. So before, it was a special exception under certain districts. The way that it was constructed in the code was a little bit vague and had caused both reviewers and applicants some challenges, caused some trouble in terms of how the code was constructed. This amendment very much cleans that up and simplifies, and it does reduce the areas within the city. Really permits these fast food restaurants in areas where generally the fabric is vehicle oriented. This isn't an area where people are walking from their homes to a restaurant or a business. These are areas where, because everything is vehicle oriented, we're not concerned as much with impacts and conflicts with a heavy pedestrian and multimodal environment. So, and then changes to restaurant limited in general, we are making absolutely no changes to where restaurants are located in the city. So only changing where the drive-through restaurants are, and that was really the intent of this bill. Next one. The other changes, as I mentioned in the introduction, we are requiring a transportation impact study for drive-through uses that would be reviewed by the Department of Mobility and Infrastructure, and it would require the applicant to implement any recommendations that are needed to reduce detrimental impacts of the drive-throughs. And then all other drive-through uses, so this is typically drive-through pharmacies and drive-through banks, have the same standards as the drive-through restaurants. So limited to the same two zoning districts, the general industrial and the highway commercial districts. And then we amended the parking requirements for restaurant uses. We did a study of comparable cities parking for a restaurant and found that ours were significantly more, required significantly more parking than a lot of our peer cities. And so we're changing restaurant fast food to be a minimum of 1 space per 500 square feet and a maximum of 1 per 175 square feet. And restaurants would be 1 parking space per 500 square feet after the first 2,400 square feet. And that's a common standard within our code. Next slide. The record of, okay, so that concludes the zoning code, the council bill regarding drive-throughs. And finally, this one will be the shortest presentation. This is Council Bill 2096 of 2021. This is the record of zoning approval change in the code text. Next slide. Record of zoning approval is or ROSA is a terminology. Basically, it is the zoning and planning equivalent of a certificate of occupancy. So in the new permitting system, instead of sharing a permit with Bureau of Building Inspection in the past, which is now permits, licenses, and inspections, or PLI, instead of sharing a building permit with PLI, we have what's called the Zoning and Development Review Permit, which is the sort of parallel equivalent of a building permit for your zoning and planning review. That at the end of that process, you apply for a certain scope of work, and then when everything has been reviewed and if it is approved, you're issued what's called a record of zoning approval, which is sort of the official document from the city that states that your review is approved. Record of zoning approval wasn't a terminology that was in the zoning code when we initially started using the new permitting system, but it was a document type that we needed. And so this bill just sort of defines what that is, inserts it into the code, and sort of cleans up where that's required and where it isn't. And then a couple other sort of missing pieces in the zoning code that we addressed with this bill. We added a definition or description of a completed application. That often comes up when we have pending legislation where somebody's interested in making sure that they have an application, a complete application in, and this sort of starts that timeline that we would compare against when new ordinances are enacted or introduced. And so having a definition of a completed application is a really critical piece of the code that we didn't have. And then we added another piece that was missing in the code. We have expiration dates, basically for zoning board decision or for issuance of a permit. Those decisions or determinations expire and you can request an extension, but we didn't have a similar expiration date for planning commission project development plan approvals. And so this fills in that blank. And then there were some other technical corrections to the language of the code, such as changing the name of Bureau of Building Inspections to Department of Permits, Licenses, and Inspections. Next slide. That is the only slide. And that concludes my presentation. Thank you all.
Thank you, Corey. And also thank you, Kate Rakes. I will now move this to testimony from registered speakers. And I see two. So please give your name and address for the public record. Each speaker will have 3 minutes to address council. All right, so our first speaker is Emily Persico.
Hello, can you all hear me?
Yes.
Perfect. Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. My name is Emily Persico. I'm speaking on behalf of Lawrenceville Corporation today. I'm the organization's community development manager. We're located at 143rd Street, and we are a community-driven nonprofit with a mission to serve as a catalyst and conduit for responsible and sustainable growth in Lawrenceville. First, I just wanted to say that we at Lawrenceville Corporation sincerely appreciate the leadership of city planning for doing this research and identifying best practices. We were happy to see it recommended by the Planning Commission are here today to speak in support of the proposed legislation. And I'm speaking specifically about the drive-through and parking bill. So misguided urban policy has led to the creation of highways, roads, and empty parking lots that have ripped through our neighborhoods and business district, privileging those with access to vehicles, incentivizing greenhouse gas emissions and air pollution, and tearing our urban fabric at its seams. As our urban policy is informed by new understandings and priorities, this and future amendments decreasing reliance on single occupancy vehicles are necessary to ensure sustainable and equitable development. We realize that this bill alone is not enough to fully modernize Pittsburgh's parking requirements. In the long run, we urge the city to complete a comprehensive analysis and reduction of parking requirements across all uses. But for now, we know that this change will provide immediate relief for new businesses and improve the urban form. Under the current code, small businesses already struggling with multiple pressures of labor shortages, the increased presence of online purchasing, and a new wave of COVID-19 face the undue burden of providing and thus incentivizing unnecessary levels of private parking. This amendment reduces that burden and improves the urban form and brings Pittsburgh's restaurant parking requirements closer to that of comparable cities. Further, this amendment is in line with existing Lawrenceville restaurant uses, many of which have sought and received special exemptions and variances for parking relief. This non-compliance with our outdated zoning laws is part of the reason the Butler Street business districts remain so walkable and vibrant. Our community has repeatedly stood for interventions that improve pedestrian experience and safety and provide a more balanced approach to mobility planning, and we stand together to support this intervention as well. We applaud the work of city planning, and we urge council to pass this amendment. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Sam Spearing. Sam?
Hi there, my name is Sam Spearing. I'm speaking today as the Housing and Mobility Coordinator for Bloomfield Development Corporation and also as a resident of Bloomfield at 111 Pearl Street. Bloomfield Development Corporation is fully in support of the zoning code amendments contained in Council Bill 2021-2095 related to drive-through and restaurant uses. After community outreach and engagement, we created our Bloomfield Mobility Principles in partnership with Studio for Spatial Practice earlier this year. Our mobility principles demonstrate a commitment to development and advocacy that supports transportation options beyond automobiles. The principles specifically outlined a desire to mitigate and minimize driveway curb cuts in our business district, as well as support land use, zoning, and parking policies that reduce vehicular traffic and reliance on personal vehicles. We feel confident that both limiting drive-through uses in urban neighborhood commercial zones, such as the Baum Center corridor, and updating parking requirements for restaurants will help to move towards achieving the vision of our mobility principles. Just this year, we've reviewed projects that add additional drive-through uses in the UNC zone along Baum Center, along roads like Baum Boulevard that already see speeds well in excess of the posted speed limit. Adding drive-throughs further degrades safety for vulnerable street users and creates additional conflict points. Limiting drive-through uses in UNC districts will help to create development that serves the needs of all road users. Reducing the parking minimum for restaurant uses is also a change that we welcome. We know from parking data from the Western Pennsylvania Regional Data Center that our on-street parking in Bloomfield is not fully utilized as is. The average utilization was roughly 72% pre-COVID and has dropped even more since then. Requiring unnecessary parking only serves to prioritize cars and incentivize driving over other transportation options. For the reasons I've outlined, we're in support of the proposed zoning changes in Council Bill 2021-2095. We thank City Planning and Council for your time and consideration. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I don't see any members online. I did have, well, first, we've exhausted our speakers online. Is there anyone in the audience that would like to make comment? Okay. So Corey, I don't want to belabor this. I just want to go straight to the visual that you have for each of these. So where it has the now and proposed, I think you have those titles on it. Can we go to the fence one? I just want to go through these real quick.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I'm sure that Kate is feverishly pulling that up. Thank you, Kate.
I think that's the first one you went through, so we'll just want to see it real quick. I think you went fence, then parking, deck.
Yep, this is fence. Oops, there we go.
All right, so now okay, they're a little different. The last one, the deck one had, I mean, don't go off the slide, but the last one kind of had like what you would need to get a variance for and what's allowed now. This one's broken up a little different. So
Yeah, so fences, so you can see where it says 4 foot allowed and
Yeah.
6.5 foot allowed. So the standard for fences in the city is that within a setback, you can have a fence that's up to 4 feet tall, that's open and ornamental. And that's how it's written. We propose to change that instead of having it related to setbacks, which not every zoning district has setbacks in the same kind of way. So it created a sometimes confusing and sometimes even created a loophole where there weren't any standards for fences or walls. So in theory, somebody could have a 10 or 20 foot wall.
all right.
We sort of took it out of the realm of setbacks and just created a simple standard. Fences can be as close, they can be 4 foot and open anywhere on the property. But once you are,
Okay.
if you
All
want
right.
to
I
go
see
up
what
to
you were saying. I just want to,
okay,
so going, you can get 6 foot right off the bat, right next to your house,
Mhm.
go down the side of it. So, and it was 4 foot allowed. Oh, okay. So I guess Wilson, which is my last name, Wilson's got to be a little bit taller now to see over the fence. talk to Tim the tool man, and then you can go the same thing with on the front. So you can come all the way up in the front, 6 foot allowed. Okay, that makes sense. Can you go to the parking one?
So this is a similar standard
And
for
so
parking.
the one that, yeah, I was trying to understand this visual. So right now the red is what?
The red is where parking pads and garages aren't permitted. And this is just one example. So this is a corner lot that has a larger setback from the street than it does on the interior side.
I forgot to ask on the fence one. So you don't have to get a variance or any sort of special permission to do 6 foot right up on side of your house then.
Up to the side of your house, you don't need a variance or any special exception.
Okay. And now with this one, same thing. The green in the proposed, you don't need any sort of exception.
That's right. The only little difference there is that at the request of the planning commission, we held back an additional 5 feet from the front of the house just to maintain, the typical rhythm of a front yard. And, the kind of, instead of having the parking come right up to the front of the house.
What about existing?
Any permitted, any existing garage or parking pad, and really any of the things that we're talking about, this would only apply to new development. Anything that was legally permitted under the prior code, if they got a variance or if it was permitted by right, we wouldn't. That's effectively grandfathered in.
Okay, and then moving on to the deck, I did have a question with the deck one.
Sure.
All right, so you're now proposing that. So the red is not permitted currently, and you would need an exception or a variance.
Right now, you would need a variance to do a deck in the red.
Okay.
There's a little bit of yellow in the current example where, if it's within the footprint of the home, sort of not closer to the street, the same sort of standard we were talking about with the fences, that you could get an administrator's exception. Now we've basically opened it up to the entire property, except that you need to comply. You need to request an administrator's exception.
So that's my question on the administrator exception on the yellow.
Mhm.
You said the administrator, the way the exception would be taken is that they would have to provide a letter from the neighbor.
Yeah, that's not mandated in the code. There's not a standard in the code that says that you have to have a letter, but it's a practice that we've had for decades, really. And it's just a good practice to, first of all, it gets neighbors talking to each other, which often helps to avoid appeals and zoning board battles and, that kind of thing. But it also helps us identify when if somebody is proposing something that is a concern, it helps us identify those cases and to really scrutinize those a lot more.
So if the neighbors hate each other, like what happens?
If the neighbors hate each other and the neighbor comes back and says, well, I went to get a letter, I baked them cookies, but they hate me and they didn't eat my cookies, and they won't give me a letter, because I ran over their cat or something like that. In the cases like that, I'm going to look at the actual case. Well, what is it that they're proposing? Is there something, is there an issue with the deck or is this just, bad blood between two neighbors? And I'll, really, I'm looking for, is there something detrimental about this application? Would it significantly impact the property values? Would it, is it potentially encroaching onto somebody else's property or something like that? So I'm going to be looking for those kinds of really extreme cases. I personally wouldn't want to get caught up in between, when two neighbors.
I just heard you say that, and I just want to get it. Yeah. But it'd be you. I mean, this will go before.
This is
planning commission, zoning commission. Which one will this go to?
So it's an administrator's exception, and that I could choose to deny the administrator's exception.
Okay.
And then if I denied the administrator's exception, then they would need to go to the zoning board. And then, that in that case, there would be a public hearing at the board.
Okay. Okay. All right. I do not have any further questions unless there's something anything else pressing you want to say before I adjourn.
No, just thank you for your time, and thanks to those that came to support this. And thanks to the commission who overwhelmingly or unanimously approved these bills or recommended approval of these bills.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you. Thanks to our speakers. And I think I can just do this on my own, huh? All right. Motion to adjourn.